Lila's house was the kind of place that exudes tranquility. A small house in a suburban neighborhood, with well-kept gardens and the soft sound of birds in the morning. She likes isolation, simple and safe routine. She was used to the peace that surrounded her, the absence of surprises. But that night, something would change. Jonah, her boyfriend, had the end of a business trip. He had embraced her before leaving, promising to return in 2 days. Lila, although she missed him, was pleased to be able to spend the night alone. She always enjoyed moments of introspection, away from the pressure of work and daily responsibilities. To mark the weekend, she invited her friends for a night of horror movies. There was something comforting about the idea of laughing and being scared together, safe. They settled on the sofa with popcorn and lost in the plots of which revolved around urban legends and haunted houses, and, in the midst of laughter and cries provoked, the relaxed atmosphere seemed to last forever. When the friends left, it was past 22h. Lila went to the door accompanied, feeling the fresh evening air invade the house. She locked the door and turned off the lights, preparing for a good rest. But as the house sank into silence, a feeling of discomfort began to settle. Something strange. She snuggled up on the couch, trying to distract herself with a book, but the silence was heavy. Then, in the middle of the stillness, a bell rang. Lila froze. She pleaded, looked out the room window, but there was no one outside. She went to the door, with a strange feeling that someone was hiding in the darkness. I quickly opened the door, but no one was in sight. She sighed in relief and closed the door firmly. There was no reason to be scared. It was just someone playing. Perhaps a child, he thought. He realized that he should not be so sensitive. But the feeling of being observed persisted. Lila returned to the couch and concentrated on her book. But the sounds that were once more natural, the rustling of leaves on the tree outside, the distant headlight of a passing car, are now more intense, more invasive. She tried to ignore it. But when the bell rang again, once more, a shiver ran through her spine. This time she went to the kitchen window. Nothing. So when I looked away from the room window, something strange made her stop. There was a shadow in front of the door, an indistinct shape, something she couldn't decipher. Lila took a deep breath, trying to laugh. It doesn't make sense. She was home alone. It could only be her imagination. But the sound came back. Not from outside, but from home. A knock on the window. Lila turned quickly, her heart beating hard, and before she could think of moving, the beat repeated itself. And then, a soft, distorted voice, almost imperceptible, said, "Help, please." Lila stopped, her neck hair was bursting. The voice sounded like it was coming from somewhere inside the house. She didn't hear that before. Trying not to give in to fear, she walked to the window of the room and looked out, but the street was deserted. It was when the voice spoke again, now clearer, "Help. I am here." Lila felt the blood freeze. She looked around, feeling that something was not right, but at the same time felt a force pushing her to investigate further. Would it be a joke? A neighbor trying to scare her? No. It didn't seem that simple. The sound of the voice now seemed a direct suggestion in his mind, as if it were coming from within the house itself. Lila could not think clearly. She began to walk around the house, listening carefully, trying to identify where that request came from. The tension in the air seemed dense, almost palpable, as if the house was alive, watching every movement it made. She came to the kitchen, stopping in front of the window. Everything seemed normal, but the feeling that he was being watched intensified. Suddenly the beats came back, this time louder, followed by a low laugh, like a distant echo, coming from somewhere above it. Lila spoke the look. The stairs. She knew that upstairs, on the upper floor, there was an empty guest room. She hesitated for a moment, the fear of spreading through her body. Then, with a courage that she barely recognized in herself, she went up the stairs. Each step seemed heavier than the previous one. When she reached the top, she stopped in front of the empty room. What would she do now? The fear of paralyzing. But she could not ignore what she felt. The voice, the whispers, the beats. It was real. It was happening. And she was no longer alone. Lila pushed the guest room door with her fingertips, the wood creaking slightly under her pressure. She entered slowly, the steps echoing in the empty corridor. The house was even quieter now, as if the sound of his breath were all that remained of life there. The room was as it always was, the bed tidy, the wood floor polished and without signs of use, the windows closed, the moonlight entering through the cracks of the curtains. Nothing seemed out of place. But the feeling was too strong to ignore. She closed the door behind her, trying to trick the mind. Nothing is betting. It's just her head, she tried to convince herself, but the feeling that something was wrong was not absent. He looked around again, as if expecting something to jump out of the shadows. It was when she played. It wasn't a voice, like before. It wasn't the sound of beats or a whisper. It was something more, strange, deeper. The sound of something gliding gently across the floor. Lila froze. The sound came from the wall to her right where an old bookcase was placed. She moved, eyes fixed on the shelf, while the sound, now clearer, seemed to come from inside her. With trembling hands, Lila left the first book on the shelf. Nothing. She looked at the next one. Nothing else. He continued so, taking books one by one, until a dry and sharp sound resounded at the bottom of the bookshelf. Lila stopped, heart beating hard, and comfortable with strength on the shelf. As she moved progressively, the sound stopped abruptly. On the back of the bookcase, something was there, hidden. Something that doesn't make sense. Lila lowered the bookcase with difficulty, feeling the tension increase as a small hidden door appeared in the corner of the wall. It was so small that it seemed irrelevant. Without thinking, she opened. What she found inside made her hesitate for a moment, a feeling of strangeness spreading throughout her body. It was an old wooden box, covered with dust. It was locked. Lila hung it out, feeling the weight of the box in her hands. He looked around, a feeling of discomfort increasing as his curiosity grew. She sat in bed and looked at the box for a while, her eyes wide with apprehension. What would you do now? Should you open it? The idea of comparing herself to something she didn't understand scared her. However, something inside her pushed her to do what she shouldn't. With a key she found inside the drawer of the bedside table, Lila finally unlocked the box. The sound of the turning key echoed in the empty room. When you opened the lid, a smell of mold and aged paper invaded your nostrils. Inside the box was a pile of papers. They were not just ordinary documents. They were old, yellowed letters with smudged ink marks. And at the bottom of the box, a small photograph, faded and torn, showed a young woman with pale face, empty eyes, and a melancholic smile. Lila took the photo and held it with her fingertips. The discomfort became more intense. It was impossible not to feel that those images carried some kind of pain, an untold story. The face in the photo looked familiar, but she could not record where. She looked at the letters again, and it was when she found something that made her stomach turn. One of the letters had Lila's name written in a handwriting she did not recognize. She frowned, sweat began to run down her forehead. How could that be? She was convinced she had never seen that letter before. The heart shot as his eyes ran through the words, which were written in a dark tone, as if the person who had written was desperate to be heard. The letter said, "You're closer than you think. What happened was not an accident. It's not just an accident. What you found is in your house, and it's calling." Lila felt a chill go through her spine. Her hands trembled as she looked at the words. Who was that person who wrote? And what did you do all that? She started breathing faster, which was getting heavy, as if something was watching. Something inside the house. Something old. Something that was awakening. Desperate, Lila tried to think, tried to rationalize the situation. But the feeling that something was approaching was unbearable. She looked back at the picture and to her horror saw that a young woman in the picture was wearing a dress that she had worn herself at a party in her youth. She had never seen that picture before. How was this possible? She didn't know, but the feeling of being in a nightmare becomes real to swallow completely. She was being called, and there was no turning back. The silence of the house was interrupted then by a very familiar sound. A doorbell. And this time, the sound did not come from outside. He came from inside the house. The sound of the doorbell, soft and insistent, echoed through the corridors of the house, as if he wanted to wake something. Lila was paralyzed for a moment, her heart beating erratically in the chest. She didn't know what was worse, the feeling of being seen or the sound that now filled the house, as an imminent warning. But one thing was certain, she wasn't alone. Lila's steps were hesitant as she walked toward the front door. Every step he took seemed an effort against the weight of an invisible presence that approached more and more. She tried to ignore the fear, but it consumed her every moment. The house was so quiet that the sound of the doorbell seemed to intensify, as if it was increasing the volume, almost as if something was trying to cross the walls. Lila looked through the crack of the door, but saw no one outside. The garden was deserted, the moonlight lit the grass that swung gently with the cold wind. There were no visitors, no strangers at the door. The sound of the doorbell, however, continued. Louder, more urgent. As if it was calling. But who? And why? The cold in Lila's spine increased every second. She opened the door slowly, with her heart in a whirl. When the door was fully open, the sound of the doorbell stopped immediately. An absolute silence must be taken into account of the environment. Lila looked back, disconcerted. There was no one. No clue, no sign of anyone. Everything was the same, as if the world had stopped for a moment. It was then that she heard, in a suggestion, something that made her flesh shiver. Lilac, The voice was weak, as if it were coming from a distant tunnel. Lila turned quickly, trying to locate the source of the sound. But there was no one. The house seemed as empty as before. But the voice was there, clear in his mind. She took a step back, the panic starting to make contact with her body. That feeling, that presence. It was as if the house had become alive. As if something was moving inside of it, something waiting for her answer. And the worst of it was that, deep in her mind, Lila knew, the voice called. It wasn't a coincidence. The house was trying to talk to her. She closed the door behind her and returned to the room, the sound of her footsteps muffled by the tension that seemed to have settled in every corner. The wooden box was still on the bed, and she watched it for a moment, as if the answer to everything was there. But there were no answers. Just more questions. More riddles. Lila could no longer trust her perception of reality. She went to bed, staring at the young woman's photo and the letter still in her hands. The words that were written were burned in your mind. You are closer than you think. What did I do that? What was she about to discover? And why was her own life now intertwined with all that? She closed her eyes, avoiding to move away the thoughts, but the voice whispered again, louder now, as if inside the house itself, resonating on all walls. You know who I am. Lila spoke sharply, feeling a tremor in her legs. She did not know what it did, but the fear, now palpable, made her want to run away. But run away to where? This house, this place, seemed to have a bond with it that is beyond comprehension. Suddenly, a distant memory appeared in his mind, like a spark that ignited a fire. She remembers her childhood, a specific place inside the house. The attic. That place had always been forbidden to her when she was little. His mother always said that the attic was closed, that it was not for anyone to climb. But she never found out why. He always wondered what was there. Now, this memory seemed to make sense in a strange and bewildering way. Lila looked at the staircase that led to the upper floor, the attic. Something was calling her there. Something she could no longer ignore. She climbed the stairs, each step creaking under her weight. The air seemed denser as she approached the attic door. The feeling that there was something behind her, watching every movement of hers, made the fear unbearable. When she reached the door, she hesitated. The key was there in her mother's drawer, in the same place where it had always been. But in fact, she needed no key. Something was already open, something was already waiting. She pushed the door and darkness took over the place, cold and impenetrable. Lila felt a shiver and ran her spine, but what made her freeze was the sound that echoed in there. It was not just the sound of wind or the creaking of wooden beams. It was a low laugh, a muffled sound, coming from the shadows of the attic, as if time itself were bending. Lila didn't know if she could handle what she was about to find out. But she knew there was no turning back. She wasn't alone at home anymore. And something was ready to reveal his secret. The game had begun. The attic was plunged into darkness. Lila could not see anything in front of her, but the muted, almost inaudible laugh seemed to intensify as she advanced. His fingers stretched to the wall in search of a switch, but the hand found only the cold and rough wood, as if the space itself was resisting its presence. With a sigh, Lila took a step forward. The sound of laughter was now clearer, and for a moment she almost could see a shadow form positioned in the depths of the attic. But before she could react, something touched her shoulder. She jumped up, her heart shot, and turned quickly, but there was no one. Panic took hold of her, but deep down she knew she was not alone. Something to watch. She appeared around, the shadows of the attic distorted by the lack of light, until her eyes fixed on an old wooden box leaning against the wall. She seemed to be for years, covered by a thin layer of dust. The box was very similar to the box that had been found in the room, but it could not be. It was small, without any inscription, but seemed to pulse with a strange energy, an energy that attracted in an almost hypnotic way. Lila felt an unexplained force as she led her way to that box. Her fingers trembled as she crouched down to open it. The lid cracked, revealing a pile of yellowed papers and faded photographs, all battered by time. Lila took one of the pictures inside, and her body froze to see what was in it. It was an old picture of his mother, with the same empty expression she spoke about when talking about the past. But he wasn't alone. Next to her, a man smiled, with a look that seemed unsettling. He was not someone that Lila confirmed, but his gaze was fixed on his mother, as if he knew something she did not know yet. Lila shook her head, trying to drive away the fear that was beginning to spread throughout her body. She took the other pictures and began to flip them quickly. Each image seemed stranger than the previous, his mother, younger, in several different places of the house, but always accompanied by the same man with piercing look. Time seemed distorted in these photos, and the feeling of discomfort increased with each new image. The last picture made her stomach turn. In it, her mother was standing at the center of a strange ritual with several other people around. All were with closed eyes, as if in trance, but the most disturbing was the man's look, now standing behind his mother, holding something in her hands. An old golden key, which seemed to emit a soft light, as if it had had its own life. Lila was breathless, the photograph slipping from her hands. A key. She remembered the key that her mother always kept, which was now in the pocket of her jacket. But the key shouldn't be there, it should be somewhere else, in a secret hiding place where your mother kept it out of anyone's sight. What did it do? Before she could recover from the shock, a cold sensation was maintained by the environment. The attic seemed to close on it, the shadows becoming denser, as if an invisible presence was taking shape. The laughter, now audible, was no longer muffled. It was a sadistic laugh, echoing in his ears, reverberating through every beam of the attic. Lila tried to step back, but her legs were paralyzed. She couldn't move. It was when the voice, that same whispering voice, resounded again, this time clear and without doubt, coming from the darkest corner of the attic. Lila, you know what you need to do. The air around her became dense, loaded with a tension that could almost cut with a knife. Lila looked at the box and then, unintentionally, her eyes fixed on the last photo, that image of the ritual. A sense of urgency seized her, and her limited mind to stop her, but her feet unwittingly carried her into the darkest corner of the attic. Ritual. A key. Upon reaching the dark corner, Lila saw what the picture had hidden, a small and discreet door, almost invisible, in the shadows. She had never been noticed before, and now everything seemed clear. The key was in her hand. She knew what I needed to do. With trembling hands, Lila inserted the key into the lock of the door. She turned. The sound of the key fitting was like a sound explosion in the oppressive silence that surrounded it. The door opened slowly, revealing an even darker space with a ladder that descended to shore. The laughter echoed once again, now closer, and the voice whispered again. Now you know the way. There is no turning back. Lila looked up at the ladder, fear clenching her chest. But something inside of her, an unknown force, pushed her forward. She didn't know what she would find down there, but she knew she couldn't go back. She was already inside. It is the house, now, the property. A journey to discover his mother's true secret had begun. The ladder going down into absolute darkness. Lila felt the weight of silence around, as if the air itself had become dense and thick, making it difficult to breathe. With each step, she felt the ground creaking under her feet, as if time was running in different amuses down there, as if the house was trying to swallow every sound and every movement of it. She descended slowly, without daring to look back. The laughter now no longer came from the attic, it was somewhere below, echoing through the walls like a moving presence. The feeling of being observed never disappears, but now it seemed more intense, more palpable. As if someone or something was waiting for you. Whatever it was very close. When she finally reached the bottom of the ladder, Lila discovered that the only light came from a lamp supplied on the ceiling, casting elongated shadows that give her life of its own. She looked around, trying to understand where she was. The place did not look like a common basement, it was a large and dark space, with wet and cracked stone walls. At the bottom, there was a door, old and stained wood, with marks of something that looked like dried blood. Her body trembled, but she could not stop. Something forced her to move on, as if the house was claiming its presence, as if that were the only possible destination. She moved from the door slowly, feeling the air become quieter as she went. When he put his hand on the doorknob, a cold sensation ran through his whole body, and the voice, which before was distant, now sounded in his ears like a deafening whisper. "You know what to do." The command was clear and direct, almost unquestionable. Lila hesitated for a second, but there was no turning back. With a push, she turned the handle and opened the door. What she found inside was not a room like any other. It was a large hall, with walls covered by old and yellowed symbols, marks made of something viscous, that resembled blood, but with an almost sticky texture, as if he were still alive. In the center of the hall, a large stone table, on which there were black candles burning with a cold blue flame. And around the table, figures hooded, all with their heads down, as if they were waiting for his arrival. Lila felt a deep shiver, but her body did not obey her anymore. Her feet advanced as if being guided by an invisible force. She had no control. The whisper in her mind said only one thing: sit down. She moved from the table and, without thinking, sat down in the empty chair, her body cold but no resistance. The hoods are moved to move. Each figure slowly manifested itself to the head, revealing faces she could not understand, distorted faces, blurred, as if they were old masks, without a real identity. But there was one who stood out. Oh man. The man in the photo. The same man who always accompanies his mother. He was standing in front of her, smiling enigmatically with eyes that seemed to look directly at her soul. His mouth moved, but before Lila could hear what he was saying, the pain took hold of his chest, as if the air had been torn from his lungs. She could breathe, but couldn't. The pressure was increasing, and her vision became blurred. That's when the figures around began to sing. The melody was soft, almost hypnotic, but at the same time full of terror. The words were incomprehensible, as if they were from an ancestral language, but Lila somehow knew that whatever happened there was not just a ritual. It was a call. A transaction. The chest pain increased, but Lila can't fight anymore. Something had broken inside her, something that connected her honestly at home, that man, sincere lineage of suffering. She saw the golden key in her pocket, shining brightly, reflecting the light of the candles. The key. She knew that it was not just a key to opening physical doors, but a path to an eternal destiny. The voice whispered again, and this time Lila answered clearly. The house is yours now. The last thing she saw before losing consciousness was the man's smile, and then the sound of something closing. The abyss was open. And Lila had become part of it. The house had complained of his daughter. Luke was starting to get used to the hectic pace of the hospital, but there was something disturbing about the night shift. The sound of machines buzzing in silence and the smell of disinfectant in the air made the old-fashioned building even more oppressive. He, who had always lived a quiet life in the countryside of Alabama, never imagined that working as a pharmacy technician would be so desolate. At 20, with an unrelenting hope of finding some meaning in the work I was doing, I was far from realizing that the night seemed to hide something much darker. The hospital where I worked was not large, but it had an air of wear and tear, as if time had left its marks on the walls and corridors. During the day, it was busy, with doctors and nurses running from one side to the other, but when night fell, everything changed. The voices faded, the smiles went out, and the hospital seemed to close in on itself. Luke never liked being there alone. There was something in the building, a kind of palpable energy, that made his heart beat faster. He tried to ignore it, counting the minutes until the end of the shift when he could finally get away from that place and go back home. That night, Luke was especially tired. The weeks of exhausting work began to take its toll. The night shifts affect his sleep, and he began to feel the effects of deprivation. The soft light of the fluorescent lamps, which flickered from time to time, mixed with the sound of the radio station that played quietly in the pharmacy room. But the silence was oppressive, as if the hospital breathed with him. He looked at the clock, 3 a.m. It was a strange time. The kind of time where any shadow, any noise, made my chest tighten. It's going to be another long night, he thought, putting away the unsettling thoughts and concentrating on the task ahead. The pharmacy was his workstation, a small room without window at the end of the corridor. He knew that people would pass through there only when they needed urgent medicine. During the early mornings, he was practically alone. Most of the patients were sleeping, and the other professionals were busy on their own rounds. The tension seemed to increase as silence took over the corridor. Luke never really explained it, but he felt that when the night fell, something changed in the hospital. He did not believe in ghosts, and although some colleagues mentioned stories about the place, he always talked out of it, as if he was afraid to let himself be affected. But tonight was different. While he was organizing the medicine drawers, something stopped him. He felt a shiver in the back of his head, as if someone was watching. Turned quickly, but the corridor was empty. The soft light of the corridor reflected on the floor, and there was no one. He let out the air, laughing at himself, tried to convince himself that he was just too exhausted. But on the next step, something made him freeze. At the end of the corridor, a faint glow stood out in one of the room's windows. He could not see what it was, but the light seemed to move, as if something was slowly crawling down the wall. The hospital was quiet, but there was something strangely out of place in the light. It wasn't the reflection of a lamp, and there didn't seem to be anyone there. He hesitated for a moment, thinking of investigating, but a feeling of discomfort or impediment. The words of a colleague, an old nurse who was there years ago, came back to his mind: this hospital has its own life. Don't touch things you don't understand. Luke steps back, trying to get away from the corridor, but the feeling of being watched is not far off. The corridor seemed to be closing on him, the shadows looking denser than ever. He rushed through the glass door of the pharmacy, trying to avoid the strange sensation, but when he turned to close the door, something stopped him. In the glass of the door, reflected, he saw a figure. A shadow, as faint as night itself, stood beside him. He swallowed dry, trying to convince himself that it was just fatigue. But when I looked again, the figure was far away. He took a deep breath, trying to ignore the accelerated accelerations. It's just the lack of sleep, it's just the lack of sleep, he repeated to himself as he walked back to the pharmacy, his body trembling lightly. The rest of the night passed slowly, and even unintentionally, Luke began to look a few more times into the empty corridors, hoping that the shadows would reveal something he did not want to see. But nothing happened immediately. However, fear did not leave him. He could not get rid of the feeling that the hospital was full of secrets, and that somehow he was being watched. But that was impossible. He was alone. Or were you? Luke's shift seemed endless. The night kept dragging on, and he could barely keep his eyes open. There was something strange around him, something he could not explain. The hospital, which during the day seemed to be a place full of movement and life, now seemed a maze of endless corridors and anguishing silences. With every corner he passed, the feeling that something was lurking increased, as if the place itself was waiting for something. Or someone. He took his eyes from the window and looked back at the door of the room. Something made him turn his head once more, and it was at that moment that he saw something else, an object. A small toy, an old doll, was in the corner of the room, half hidden under the bed. The doll looked out of place, dirty and with big eyes. But what made him even more uneasy was the expression on the doll's face. There was something disturbing about the way their eyes were wide as they watched Luke, waiting for something. Luke felt the pressure in his chest increase. He didn't know what was going on, but something inside him said that he would probably go out immediately. He took a step back, trying to fend off the feeling that the room was alive, breathing in some way, and that he was waiting for his presence. But before he could leave, the sound of a door slamming in the hallway made him freeze. He turned quickly, with his heart beating fast, hoping to see someone. But the corridor was empty, as always. The hospital seemed as quiet as before. But the feeling that something was wrong, that he was no longer alone, increased. It was at this moment that Luke heard a message, soft and unmistakable, coming from somewhere far away. He couldn't understand the words, but knew it wasn't his mind playing tricks. It was something real, something that was there. The feeling of panic was instantaneous. He turned to the door, wanting to run out of the room, but the sound of the door closing suddenly made him stop again. He looked at the door of room 213 and realized, with a shudder, that it was now completely closed. Unintentionally, his eyes fixated again on the doll, which looked even closer, his eyes shining in a way he swore he had not seen before. The room was becoming increasingly oppressive, and Luke could no longer distinguish what was real and what wasn't. He tried to open the door to get out, but she wouldn't. She stood there, standing still, as if the room was holding him there, as if he were a prey. Luke knew he needed to leave, but could not control the panic that was taking him. Finally, in a last effort, he left the door with all his might until it finally opened. He ran down the dark corridor, without looking back, until he reached the pharmacy. When the door closed behind you, the sound of silence was almost deafening. He was safe now, but he knew that feeling of being there would never go away. He could still hear the whisper in his mind, the sound of something called by him. And deep in his soul he knew that room 213 was not just a number, and that the hospital was holding much more than he ever imagined. Luke couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The feeling of being observed never left him, and as the days passed, the weight of the experience in room 213 seemed to become more dense. In the hospital, everything seemed normal. Shifts continued, the same conversations in the hallways, the same tired faces of doctors and nurses. But in his mind, a voice whispered, calling him back. He tried to disregard what he had seen and heard, trying to convince himself that fatigue and stress distorted his perception. But as night drew near and silence took over the hospital, a part of him knew it was not just imagination. Room 213 was still there, waiting for him. In the following days, Lucas found some explanation for the mysterious room, trying to find records, something that could give him answers. But the more I investigated, the more the feeling that I was being ignored increased. There was no mention of room 213 in official records or files. The hospital was full of documents and files, but room 213 seemed to have been erased from history as if it had never existed. It was then that he remembered a detail. The old hospital janitor, Mr. Luke, had exchanged a few words with him, but he knew the man had worked for decades. Maybe he knows something. One afternoon, when he had a chance, Luke found the janitor in the small maintenance room at the back of the hospital. "Mr. Harold," Luke began with hesitation, "do you know room 213? Something strange happened there recently, and, well, I can't find anything about him in the records." The caretaker spoke his head slowly, his tired eyes studying Luke for a moment. He was a tall, thin man with gray hair and a weathered countenance, but there was an intensity in his eyes that Luke had never noticed before. When the janitor spoke, his voice was low, almost like a whisper. "Room 213 is not something you should move, my young man," he said, with a somber look. I've worked here longer than I can tell, and that room has a story. One no one in the hospital wants to remember. Luke was bothered by the answer, but a curiosity led him to insist. What happened there? Why is the room so strange? The caretaker took a deep sigh and looked down at the floor as if he was preparing for something. Many years ago, when the hospital was still new, room 213 was occupied by a very peculiar patient. No one knew exactly what he had, but over time the doctors found out something strange. The patient did not age, did not heal. He stood there in the same state day after day, as if time did not touch him. Luke felt a shiver, but continued to listen without interruption. Some say the patient was a very sick man, but others say he had something else. Something that wasn't of this world. What I know is that, after some time, strange things happened. Objects move alone, doors close and open without explanation. Even the employees could hear voices and feel presence in the corridors. One night, the man simply disappeared without a trace. And as far as I know, all those we investigated, or went into there, were never the same. Luke stood silent, processing the words of the caretaker. Something in that report didn't seem right, but he couldn't help feeling a growing anxiety. But, why is the room still closed? Why does no one talk about it? The caretaker looked at him with a grave expression. Because some mysteries should not be solved. The hospital has changed, people have changed, but room 213 remains. No matter how many years go by, it's there, waiting. Luke didn't know what to think. The idea of a missing patient, combined with reports of unexplained specifics, made the room seem increasingly sinister. But there was something else, something that bothered him deeply. The caretaker seemed to know more, as if he was trying to hide something. With a last look anxious for the man, Luke said goodbye and was late, mind spinning with the words of the caretaker. He knew he could no longer ignore room 213. There was something there, and he was determined to find out what would really happen in that space. That night, after the shift, Luke made a decision. He would return to room 213. He could not get away from something so mysterious and disturbing. He needed to know what was happening. He couldn't let fear control him. But what he did not know was that room 213 was not just waiting for him. He had been drawn in, like a prey for a trap. And as night fell and he was preparing to face the unknown, Lucas felt a sense that something, or someone, was already waiting, awaiting his arrival. Lucas could no longer deny the need to find out what was going on in room 213. The words of the caretaker echoed in his mind, but curiosity was dominating his reason. He knew the hospital should have erased any trace of this room for a reason, but there was something inside that said he needed to go deeper. When Luke's shift ended that night, he didn't show up at home as usual. Instead, he headed straight for the old hospital wing where room 213 was, with lights out and silence prevailing throughout the building. The shadows on the walls seemed to gain life of their own, and the air was denser, as if the very atmosphere of the place had been altered. He knew the room was locked, but after talking to the janitor, he had no doubt that he would find a way in. Luke moved from the old wing's front door, his hands sweating, and removed from inside his jacket the set of old keys he had taken from one of the administrative lockers during his investigation. The hospital security system had not noticed the lack of a key to the room, since no one had used it for years. When he inserted the key into the lock, the door cracked, and the sound seemed to echo throughout the room. A cold feeling ran through his spine, but he did not flinch. He pushed the door hard, and came in. The room 213 was almost unrecognizable. The place was in total darkness, with only the dim light of the corridor partially illuminating the interior. The dust covered the aged furniture, and the air was heavy, as if time had been held back in there. The bed was empty, but Luke could feel a presence. Something doesn't seem distorted. He did not know if it was his fear, his anxiety, or if the environment really emanated something, but the feeling that something was watching him made him feel brief before that invisible force. Luke moved into the center of the room, and his eyes began to get used to the darkness. It was when he noticed, near the broken window, a small bedside table, on which there was a blurry photograph. Approaching her, he took the photo and, looking closely, felt his heart go up. The image was black and white and showed a man, no, not a man, but something that Luke identified, a patient, as the caretaker describes. But this patient was not alone. Beside him was a figure he did not recognize, a gloomy face with empty eyes that seemed to look directly at him. A sense of terror or invasion. Luke felt an urgent need to leave the room, but something detected him. He heard a faint voice, almost inaudible, but that made his blood freeze. "Get out." The voice was grave, echoing in his mind, and he could not discern where it came from. The air became heavier, and the cold increased, as if the room itself was breathing. Suddenly, the fluorescent lights in the hallway blinked, and the door closed with a bang. Luke tried to open the door, but it was locked again. He was stuck. It was at that moment he saw. The room wasn't just a brick and wood construction. He felt that he was facing something much greater, something supernatural. Something that should not be touched. And before he could react, the room transformed. The ground, which before seemed normal, now distorts. The sound of the wind outside has become deafening, as if trying to invade space. The walls narrowed, and the air seemed to vibrate. Luke looked back and saw the figure in the window, that shadow he had seen in the photograph. She was there, standing still, as if observing everything, without saying a word but conveying a feeling of growing oppression. "You shouldn't be here," the voice whispered again, now clearer, closer. Luke, with his heart beating fast, looked at the figure. I couldn't believe what he was selling, but the image before him wasn't just an illusion. It was real. The figure in the invited window in a way that Luke would never forget, a distorted smile, full of unknown intentions. His empty eyes reflect an endless darkness. He tried to move away, but his legs were heavy. Something was holding him, not physically, but mentally. He felt as if the room was feeding on his own anxiety, his fear, his doubt. Everything he feared was now taking shape. With a clouded mind, he looked at the door again, desperate for an exit. It was when the door started to open slowly, but it wasn't for him to escape. It was for something to come in. "You won't go out, Luke," the voice said again, louder now. "You'll never leave." The cold intensified even more. The darkness expanded as an unbeatable force, and Luke felt his forces vanish, as if life itself was being drained from him. He tried to scream, but his voice failed. He tried to run, but his feet were glued to the ground. And before he could understand what was happening, room 213 swallowed him completely. In the days following what happened in room 213, Lucas can no longer distinguish reality from what he felt was just a nightmare. The hospital looked the same, but there was something different. The silence on the walls was no longer just an echo of empty corridors. He felt the hospital's eyes on him, as if something was watching him every time he moved. Luke began to avoid the older areas of the hospital. He dared not look at the corridor leading to the ward where room 213 was. But at the same time, the desire to understand what had really happened consumed him. He found answers in books, in conversations with other employees, but nothing that seemed to make sense. There was no record of anything that explained what he had seen, what he had felt. All he knew was that room 213 was immersed in a dark mystery, and he could not break free of this obsession. One night, while reviewing some old documents in the hospital archive, Luke found something unexpected. Among the piles of yellowed papers, there was an aged leather paste with a simple label, Case 213. The name was not strange. He felt a chill when he opened a folder. Inside, I found the history of a patient who had been admitted to the hospital decades ago, a man named Thomas Hawke. The patient was diagnosed with a terminal illness, but what caught Luke's attention was not the diagnosis. It was the description of events that occurred during Hawk's hospitalization, events that involved something beyond medical understanding. The report indicated that Thomas Hawk had alleged to have seen shadowy figures in his room. He spoke about a presence that watched him while he slept, and in his last days the patient claimed that an entity was claiming him. The most frightening was that the patient received a door in his delusions, saying that something was waiting behind her, something that should not be released. But the most disturbing was the last note of the responsible doctor: the patient seems to have gone mad, can no longer be evaluated. I request a transfer to a psychiatric institution. The case was closed and Thomas Hawk's name was erased from the records. What remained, however, was room 213, the room where Hawk had been interrupted until his death, the room that Luke had visited. The patient file was not the only thing he found in that folder. There was also a small notebook, with pages torn and hastily written. It was a diary, and when he opened the first page, Luke felt a shiver. The words were difficult to read, but he managed to make sense of some passages. "They're coming. I can't sleep anymore. Something is behind the door, someone's waiting, and I can't let you in. I saw something today. Something I can't explain. The window, there's no one there, but something is watching me. I'm running out of time. They'll take me. There's no way out. The room is alive." Hawk's words echo in his mind. Luke didn't want to believe it, but everything he had experienced seemed to confirm those notes. He had seen the shadows, heard the voice, felt the presence. It was not just the room, it was something deeper, something that was connected to all the others who had been there. Something he now knew could not be ignored. Desperate for answers, Lucas sought more information about the hospital. He tried to access old records, but they all wanted to be erased, as if the hospital wanted to bury his past. However, one afternoon he found something that stopped him. On the wall of a distant corridor was a small metal plate covered with dust. It was an old inscription, which said, "To those who are beyond, the doors are always open." The phrase does not make sense for that moment. But something inside him said that if he did not understand what was behind the riddle, he could never be free. Luke then decided to return to room 213. Not as a doctor or investigating curiosity, but as someone who felt he should face that head-on, no matter how much his body and mind screamed for him to run away. He hoped the answers would set him free, but in fact he was about to discover the most terrifying truth of all: the hospital wasn't just taking care of patients. He was holding something there. Something that should not be interrupted. Something that should never have been released. When you entered the room again, the feeling of being lent was even stronger. The door closed behind him with a snap, and for the first time Luke felt no fear. He was ready to face what he wanted it to be. And then he heard the voice again, clearer than ever. "You should never have come here, Luke." With a shudder, he turned to a broken window. There in the reflection he saw what he had never noticed before. The face of Thomas Hawk, with empty eyes and a distorted smile, looking directly at him. Room 213 was not just a place of death. It was the home of something that fed on the very essence of people. Something that waited patiently, always. As Hawk's shadow advanced toward him, Luke felt the presence of what was waiting for him behind the door. N/D. The clock was 10:45 when Alex closed his laptop with an anxious smile. He was 18 years old and has always been fascinated by mysteries, haunting stories, and the adrenaline of exploring the unknown. Since childhood, his favorite pastime was to read about cursed places or watch videos of paranormal investigations. Now he finally had a chance to star in his own adventure. The Blackwood Pines National Park was known for two things: its unspoiled beauty during the day and the sinister legends that surrounded its nights. Stories of inexplicable disappearances, of flute sounds echoing in the darkness, and of a hooded figure wandering among the trees made the place become notorious in the region. Alex always wanted to explore it at night, but had never managed a companion willing to face fear. Tonight, however, would be different. After days of insistence, he managed to convince his friend Emma to accompany him. Emma was the opposite of Alex, pragmatic, skeptical, and not too keen on taking risks. But something in his excitement made her give in. Or maybe it was the promise that if everything were a fiasco, he would pay for tickets to her favorite band's next show. They met in the empty parking lot of the park, with only the moonlight lighting the place. The cold wind carried the smell of dry leaves and damp soil, while the sound of crickets and the occasional rustling of trees created a natural but disturbing soundtrack. "This is a terrible idea," Emma muttered, crossing her arms. She wore a cheeky sweatshirt and hiking pants. Her expression was a mixture of irritation and apprehension. "Relax, it will be fun," replied Alex, adjusting the flashlight in his hand. "Imagine telling this story later. We'll survive the haunted forest and laugh about it tomorrow." Emma snorted, but followed Alex as he lit the entrance to the trail with his flashlight. The wooden board said, "Entrance, Trail of the Spirit," in letters almost erased by time. "That name doesn't help," commented Emma. "It's just marketing to scare tourists." "They love that kind of thing," Alex replied, trying to sound confident. As they advanced, the air seemed to get heavier. The moonlight gradually faded as the trees closed above them, turning the trail into a corridor of shadows. Alex, always in front, pointed the lantern to the ground, while Emma looked around, suspicious. "Did you hear that?" she asked suddenly, stopping in the middle of the way. "Heard what?" "Like a whistle. Far away." Alex looked at her and for a second thought of playing, but gave up. "It must be the wind. Come on, there's still so much to see." Emma was reluctant, but kept on going. They didn't know that this would be the last quiet night for a long time. The track seemed to narrow, and the sound of the stifled footsteps through the damp earth was the only thing Alex and Emma could hear for long minutes. Alex's lantern lit the way, but the feeling of being watched began to weigh on both. "Doesn't it seem strange that there's no one else here?" asked Emma, breaking the silence. "It's a natural park at night. Normal people are sleeping or watching TV," Alex replied, trying to mask his own restlessness. "Besides, it's Friday. Who goes into a scary forest on purpose?" Emma raised an eyebrow. "You." The attempt at humor failed to relieve tension. The wind blew stronger, making the branches above them crack. Emma stopped suddenly. "Are you listening again?" she whispered, her eyes wide. Alex frowned, tilting his head to hear better. That's when he also noticed a faint sound, distant, like a melody. A flute? No, it sounded more like a rhythmic whistle coming from inside the forest to the left of the trail. "It's the wind," he said quickly, but the tone of his voice betrayed him. "That's not wind, Alex," Emma rebuked, taking a step back. "Okay, it could be some animal. Wolves howl, owls make noise, maybe it's something like that." "Alex, since when do wolves play the flute?" He tried to laugh, but the tension was palpable. Despite the discomfort, Alex did not want to give up. He pointed the lantern into the forest, towards the sound. "Let's just take a look," he suggested. "Are you crazy? Why would we go after that? To find out what it is. What if it's just a resident or something? Don't you want to know the truth?" Emma hesitated, but followed when Alex took the first steps off the main trail. The sound seemed closer now, swaying like a melody without a set rhythm. It was unnatural, but also not completely scary. Still, something about that made the hair of both of them shiver. As they moved away from the trail, the terrain became more uneven. Dry branches broke under his feet, and the trees were denser, almost suffocating. Alex's flashlight did not illuminate much beyond a few meters, but the sound was increasingly clear. Suddenly, Emma held his arm. "There." Alex stopped and pointed the lantern where she was looking. Between the trees, something shone. Two small, fixed points like eyes reflecting light. "He has frozen." "It's an animal," he said, though his voice sounded uncertain. But the dots disappeared in a blink of an eye, and the sound of the flute stopped abruptly. The silence was so sudden that it seemed deafening. "This is not right," Emma whispered, holding his arm tighter. Alex tried to move forward, but Emma pulled him back. "Alex, no. Let's go back. Now." He hesitated, but her look convinced him. They turned to return to the main track, but it was when they noticed something even more disturbing. The tracks that they left on the ground just disappeared. "Where's the way?" asked Emma, her voice trembling. Alex turned the lantern in all directions, but all he saw were trees. The trail seemed to have dissolved, leaving them completely surrounded by dense forest. The sound of the flute came back. This time, much closer. The sound of the flute, now clearer, seemed to circulate around them. Emma held Alex's arms so tight that he felt her nails sticking into the skin. "Alex, this is not normal. It's not a person. It's not an animal. We need to get out of here." I know. Alex replied, trying to keep calm, but his voice trembled. He pointed the lantern in all directions, but the trees looked identical. There was no sign of the trail. Emma took her phone and lit the flashlight, but the screen did not show GPS signal. She tried to open the offline map that she had downloaded before the trail, but it didn't load. "That doesn't make sense. I downloaded this yesterday. How can it be empty?" The flute sounded louder, almost as if it was right behind them. Alex turned quickly, lighting up the void. Nothing. Only trees. It was then that he noticed something peculiar. The leaves of the nearby trees swayed gently, but there was no wind. He looked at Emma, who also noticed and began to retreat. "I'm serious, Alex. Let's run. Any direction is better than staying here." Before he could answer, Alex's flashlight failed. He shook the object desperately, but the light only blinked, more and more dim, until they died out for good. Now they depended only on the cell phone of Emma, whose light seemed more fragile than it should. "Don't let go of the flashlight, maybe come back," said Emma, holding his arm and pulling it. "This way." They began to walk quickly in a random direction, trying to move away from the sound, but the melody seemed to chase them, oscillating between near and far. Then Alex tripped on something on the floor. He fell hard, but Emma pulled him up before he could look right at what it was. "Get up, Alex. Not stop now." But when he looked back, in the light of the cell phone, saw what had knocked him down, a mask. It did not seem like a lost object by chance. It was made of wood, carved with strange symbols, and seemed to have been left there intentionally. Alex picked her up, without thinking. "Are you crazy? Why are you taking this?" cried Emma, horrified. "It may be important. It may explain what is happening." He kept the mask in his backpack, even with her protests. The flute stopped again, plunging them into an oppressive silence. But soon something new happened. The sound of heavy and slow steps began to echo. They did not come from one place. They surrounded them, as if something or someone were walking in circles around them. Alex grabbed Emma's hand. "Run." This time they ran aimlessly, dodging branches and fallen logs, while the footsteps and the sound of the flute echoed more intensely. Finally, they reached a small clearing. In the center of it, there was a large stone covered with more symbols. The moon illuminated space in a supernatural way, almost like a spotlight. "This is so wrong," whispered Emma, breathless. Alex looked around, trying to find a way out. It was then that he realized that the trees around the clearing were not normal. Their trunks seemed twisted, almost as if they formed humanoid figures watching them. "They're leading us somewhere," Alex murmured. "Who is guiding us?" Emma asked, but before he could answer, the sound of the flute came back, this time so loud and close that it seemed to be inside their heads. On the edge of terror, Emma cried. "Enough! Who's there? What do you want?" The sound stopped again. For a few seconds, there was only the sound of his panting breaths. Then a voice echoed, deep and reverberating, but coming from nowhere. "You entered without permission." Alex and Emma exchanged a look of pure horror. Who's there?" Alex asked, his voice almost failing. "You shouldn't be here." From the middle of the trees, something began to form, like a shadow denser than the darkness around. It had no definite shape, but carried an overwhelming presence. Emma started to back down, pulling Alex. "Get out of here. Get out of here now." But before they could make any movement, the figure pointed to Alex. "You brought the symbol. Now, it's marked." Emma screamed, and the cell phone light went out, plunging them into total darkness. The darkness was absolute. Emma and Alex could barely hear their own breath, choked by the weight of silence. The words of the voice still echoed in their minds. "Now, it is marked." "Emma. Emma, are you there?" Alex whispered, trying to feel around, but his hands found just empty. "I'm here." Her voice came from somewhere near, but something seemed different, farther away than he expected. A faint glow appeared in the clearing. It was not natural. It seemed to emanate from the big stone in the center, which now had symbols pulsing in a greenish light. Alex tried to approach, but a sound of footsteps echoed again, making him freeze. "Emma, run!" he shouted, but realized she was no longer by his side. He turned in panic, calling for her, until he saw her silhouette back to him, standing still, looking at the stone. "Emma, what are you doing?" She did not answer. Alex ran to her and touched her shoulder, but when he turned his face, he realized it wasn't Emma. It was the face of an unknown woman, with empty eyes and pale skin, who smiled in a disturbing way. "Emma is no longer here." Alex screamed and backed, stumbling on the ground. The woman fell into a cloud of shadows and disappeared. "Alex." Emma's voice echoed from somewhere in the forest. He ran towards the sound, but as he reached the edge of the clearing, he realized that he was trapped. Every step he took seemed to bring him back to the center, where the stone pulsed. "You can't leave." The voice of before returned, deep and severe. The dense shadow formed again before him, now with a more defined form, high, with humanoid contours, but with eyes as bright as coal in ember. "What do you want from me?" Alex screamed, desperate. "You got the symbol. It's the key to balance. Now, you belong in the forest. I don't want that. It was a mistake. Alex tried to throw the mask on the floor, but when he opened the backpack, it wasn't there anymore. Instead, he felt something cold in his pocket. He put his hand in and found the mask, which seemed to have shrunk, fitting perfectly into his palm. There is no error, the voice continued. There is a price to invade the sacred. Suddenly the sound of the flute returned, but this time it seemed to come from within him. Alex fell to his knees, holding his head as the melody reverberated in his mind. Please, I just want to get out of here. The shadow leaned, approaching him. There is an exit. What do I have to do? Alex asked, almost without strength. Take the symbol to another. Choose who will carry the weight. So you are free. Alex felt despair take hold of you. I can't do that. This is wrong. The shadow just watched him in silence, his eyes shining more intensely. Then stay. The forest will be your eternal home. Before he could answer, Alex felt a hand on his shoulder. He quickly turned around, finding Emma, panting and covered in scratches. Alex. Thank God, I found you. What's going on here? Alex hesitated. The mask was still in his hand. He looked at Emma, then at the shadow, who seemed to be waiting for his decision. What are you going to do, Alex? Emma asked, her eyes filled with fear and confusion. He held the mask with strength, the weight of choice crushing it. Alex stared at Emma, her mind in a whirlwind of despair and doubt. The shadow remained motionless, as if waiting patiently for his decision. The mask in his hand seemed to pulsate, as if it had life of its own. Alex, what is that? Emma asked, her voice trembling. He wanted to explain, but the words didn't come. All he knew was that he had to make a choice, one that would change their lives forever. I don't know, Emma. I just want to get out of here. The shadow moved slowly, its presence overwhelming. Choose. Or both belong to the forest. Emma looked at Alex, confused. Pick what? What's he talking about? Alex felt the panic grow. He thought about throwing the mask away, but knew it would not work. The object seemed to be connected to it in a supernatural way. If I give it to her, will she? He could not finish the thought, but the look of the shadow seemed to respond, yes. Alex, please. We need to get out of here. I trust you, Emma said, grabbing her hand. These words struck him like a blow. He loved her, but the weight of fear and despair was unbearable. He closed his eyes, looking for a solution, but everything seemed to lead to the same point: either he would give up the mask, or they would be trapped forever. Slowly, Alex extended the mask to Emma. I am sorry, Emma. What? What are you doing? She backed away, but Alex grabbed her arm hard, tears running down her face. I have no choice. Before she could resist, Alex pressed the mask against her hands. The moment the object touched her skin, Emma uttered a shrill scream, which echoed through the forest. The mask seemed to merge with her, her eyes widening in pure terror. No! Alex, please! The shadow approached, enveloping Emma in its darkness. The choice was made. Emma was dragged to the center of the clearing, her figure being consumed by darkness. Alex screamed, trying to run towards her, but was stopped by an invisible force. You're free, the voice echoed. The brightness of the stone disappeared, and the clearing was taken by absolute silence. Alex woke up at the entrance of the trail, sunlight crossing the trees. He was alone. Emma, he called, but only heard the sound of birds in the distance. Trying to understand what happened, Alex realized that the mask was no longer with him. The weight he felt in his soul, however, remained. He ran down the track back to the car, but something looked different. Time seemed to have passed longer than he had imagined. Dry leaves covered the path, and his car was wrapped in dust and cobwebs. When she finally arrived in town, no one seemed to recognize her name or know who Emma was. It was as if she had never existed. Alex tried to live his life normally, but at night he was tormented by nightmares of the forest and the sound of the flute. Deep down, he knew that he had sealed Emma's fate to save himself. One day, he received an anonymous package at his door. Inside was the mask. The message was scribbled on a piece of paper. "Now it's your turn to choose again.